In the summer of 1518, in a city in what is now France, a woman started dancing in the street. And she couldn't stop. Not for hours, not for days. Her feet bled through her shoes. Her body was shutting down, and still she kept moving. Within weeks, 400 people were dancing alongside her. Some collapsed, some had heart attacks, some died. And nobody, not the doctors, not the priests, not the city government, had any idea what was happening. This wasn't a festival, this wasn't a celebration, this wasn't a performance. This was 400 human beings losing control of their own bodies, in public, in broad daylight, for weeks on end. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. It's real. Every single detail, documented in city records, church archives, and medical accounts that still exist today. The dancing plague of 1518 is one of the most bizarre, most disturbing, and most human events ever recorded in history. And 500 years later, we still don't fully understand what caused it. This is that story.
Before we talk about the dancing, we need to talk about the world it happened in. Because nothing about this event makes sense unless you understand what life actually felt like in early 16th century Europe. And the answer is terrifying. Not in a dramatic movie trailer way, in a slow, grinding, daily way that most of us today genuinely cannot imagine. Let's start with food. For most of the late 1400s and early 1500s, harvests across Western Europe had been failing, repeatedly, unpredictably, catastrophically. Cold springs killed crops before they could grow, wet summers rotted grain in the fields, winters arrived early and destroyed livestock that entire families depended on to survive. For the poor, which was the vast majority of people, this wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence on a slow timer. When harvests fail, food prices spike. When food prices spike beyond what people can afford, they stop eating enough. And when people stop eating enough, their immune systems collapse. And when immune systems collapse, disease moves in. Modern medicine didn't exist in 1518. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of how infection spread from one person to another. A minor cut that got infected could kill a grown adult in days. A fever that swept through a household could empty it of the living within a week. In Strasbourg specifically, the city where the dancing plague would occur, there had been a documented outbreak of plague just 1 year earlier, in 1517. The year before everything fell apart. People had buried their neighbors, buried their children, watched their families disappear. And then, on top of all of that physical suffering, came something that hit even harder in the psychological sense. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published a document that changed the world. His 95 theses challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, publicly, boldly, in a way that had never been done before at that scale. The Protestant Reformation had begun. Now, to a modern person, that might sound like a distant theological debate, interesting maybe, important historically, but not something that would destabilize your sense of reality. For the people of Strasbourg in summer of 1518, it was an existential crisis. The Catholic Church wasn't just where they went on Sundays, it was the framework through which they understood everything. Why people got sick, why children died, why disasters happened. God wasn't abstract to these people. God was immediate, active, present in every event of their lives. And the church, the structure that was supposed to mediate between them and God, was cracking open. So here is Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. A city of roughly 20,000 people, packed tightly inside its walls, operating on inadequate food, still recovering from a recent plague epidemic, spiritually shaken by the collapse of religious certainty. And absolutely saturated every single person within those walls with the belief that invisible forces could act directly on human beings. Demons were not metaphors to these people. Curses were not superstition. Divine punishment was documented history. This was the pressure cooker. And into it walked Frau Troffea.
Her name was Frau Troffea, and that is almost everything we know about her. No portrait, no diary, no record of her age or her life or her family. If the summer of 1518 had been an ordinary summer, she would have vanished from history entirely, one of the countless millions of people who lived and died in the medieval world and left no trace at all. But the summer of 1518 was not ordinary. On a day in mid-July, the exact date is lost to history, Frau Troffea stepped outside her home in Strasbourg, and she began to dance. No music, no festival, no celebration. She just started moving. At first, people probably assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was in an unusually good mood. Maybe something had happened that morning that made her feel like dancing. People went back to their business. But she didn't stop. Hours passed. She was still moving. The sun went down. She was still moving. Night came. She was still moving. By the time the next morning arrived, neighbors were no longer curious. They were scared. Historical accounts from this period describe her movement as something beyond normal dancing. She wasn't performing. She wasn't showing off. Witnesses described it as involuntary, as if her body was operating independently of any decision she was making, as if something had taken hold of her and would not let go. She continued, without meaningful rest, for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. By the end, her feet were torn open and bleeding. Her body had been pushed so far past its limits that the deterioration was visible. When she finally collapsed from sheer physical exhaustion, she was in a state of severe distress. But here's the thing. By the time she collapsed, she wasn't alone anymore. Others had started dancing, and whatever this was, it was spreading. The second dancer appeared within days, then a third, then more. Within approximately 1 week, around 30 people in Strasbourg were reported to be dancing uncontrollably. 30! And the number kept climbing. At the height of the outbreak, contemporary sources placed the number at roughly 400 individuals in a city of 20,000. That's 1 in every 50 people. Think about what that actually means. You can't go to the market without seeing it. You can't walk to church without passing it. You can't look out your window without witnessing it. The dancing had escaped from the single side street where Frau Troffea had started and spread throughout the entire city. But here's what makes it genuinely disturbing. These weren't people dancing joyfully. Contemporary witnesses described the dancers as appearing to be in pain, grimacing, some weeping openly, some crying out, their faces showing something that looked far more like agony than celebration. Many had bloody feet. Medieval cobblestones are not forgiving surfaces, and these people had been moving on them for hours, then days. Some had swollen joints, some were disoriented, some had begun to physically deteriorate in ways that were visible from a distance, and still they kept moving. The people of Strasbourg watching all of this weren't just confused, they were terrified. Because if this thing, whatever it was, could take hold of your neighbor, your friend, the woman who lived 2 doors down, what was stopping it from taking hold of you? Here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating. When we hear 400 people dancing uncontrollably, our modern instinct is to immediately start looking for scientific explanations. We think about neurology, about psychology, about contagion, about mass behavior. The people of 1518 didn't have any of those frameworks. What they had was a complete integration of the spiritual and the physical. In their worldview, the body and the soul weren't governed by separate laws. Invisible forces, both divine and demonic, could and did act on human beings directly. So when 400 of their neighbors started dancing themselves to death in the streets, the question wasn't what biological mechanism is causing this. The question was, what did we do to deserve this? 3 explanations circulated through the city. The first, divine punishment. God was angry. The community had sinned through pride, through greed, through moral failure, and this was God's response. This wasn't a metaphor to the people of Strasbourg. The plagues of Egypt were documented history. The destruction of Sodom was documented history. God punishing entire communities for collective sin was something that happened. The second explanation centered on a specific saint, Saint Vitus, a 4th-century Christian martyr who had become associated in the folk beliefs of the Rhine Valley with a particular kind of curse. According to tradition, Saint Vitus could strike people with uncontrollable movement. The condition even had a name in popular usage, Saint Vitus's dance, and there was a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus not far from Strasbourg, in the mountains near Saverne. That detail would matter later. The third explanation was the darkest, demonic possession. The belief that the devil or agents acting in his service had physically entered the bodies of the affected individuals and was controlling them against their will. This was mainstream theology. The Catholic Church had formal exorcism procedures precisely because possession was considered real and documented. All 3 explanations shared one assumption. This is supernatural. And if it's supernatural in origin, then physical solutions are useless. That assumption would determine every decision that followed, and it would turn a crisis into a catastrophe. By late July, the City Council of Strasbourg had to act. 400 people were dancing in the streets. Some were dying. The normal functioning of the city was breaking down. The authorities consulted their physicians, debated the causes, and then made a decision that, by any modern standard, was one of the most catastrophically misguided public health choices in recorded history. They decided the dancing should be encouraged. Let that sink in for a second. 400 people dancing themselves to death, and the official government response was, let them keep going. Here's the reasoning. The physicians consulted by the council worked within a framework called the 4 humors, an ancient Greek medical theory that governed how illness was understood in 1518. According to this theory, the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance. Illness was imbalance. The physicians concluded the dancing was caused by an overheating of the blood, and the proposed cure for overheated blood within this framework was to allow the heat to exhaust itself naturally. So, let them keep dancing until the condition burns itself out. Combined with the religious theory connecting this to Saint Vitus, whose legend was associated with dance, the council made its move. They cleared the grain market, they opened the guild halls, they created designated open spaces throughout the city where the dancers could continue without blocking traffic. And then, and this is the part that's almost impossible to believe, they hired musicians, drummers, pipers, professional performers paid from the city treasury to provide live music for an ongoing mass death event. The logic was that structured rhythm might guide the movement towards some kind of resolution,
that music might invite St. Vitus's mercy, that organized dancing was better than chaotic dancing. What actually happened was the opposite of everything they intended. The music drew crowds. The crowds gathered around the dancers. The atmosphere shifted from fearful observation to something more immersive, more intense, more contagious. And as more people gathered, more people started dancing. Within days of the musicians being brought in, the number of active cases had increased significantly. The designated spaces were filled with moving bodies. The sound of drums and pipes echoed through streets that should have been going about their normal business. And people were dying in those spaces. The exact death toll is impossible to verify from surviving records, but contemporary sources are clear that deaths occurred from heart failure, from stroke, from total physical exhaustion, in people who were already weakened by malnutrition and recent epidemic disease. People were dying in the streets of Strasbourg, and the city's response had made it worse.
Let's stop here for a moment, because behind every number in those historical records, there was a person, a real human being, with a body that had limits. What does prolonged, involuntary physical movement actually do to a person? Modern sports medicine gives us a clear picture, and it's not pretty. The human body, under sustained physical exertion, burns through its energy reserves fast, without adequate nutrition to replace what was consumed. And remember, these people were already operating on inadequate food. The body starts consuming itself. Muscle tissue breaks down. Energy reserves collapse. Dehydration sets in within hours of sustained sweating without fluid replacement. It impairs cognitive function, causes severe muscle cramps, and in extreme cases, it's fatal on its own. The joints aren't designed for continuous repetitive stress without rest. Cartilage degrades, surrounding tissue becomes inflamed. Pain builds to levels that would stop most people cold, except these people couldn't stop. The feet, on medieval cobblestone streets without adequate footwear, after days of continuous movement, the damage is progressive and brutal. Blisters forming and rupturing, skin wearing away entirely, open wounds developing on hard stone surfaces. In 1518, an infected open wound on your foot was a standard cause of death. And the heart, the cardiovascular system, pushed to sustained high output without rest, in people already weakened by malnutrition and recent plague, the risk of cardiac events was real, immediate, and deadly. This is what was physically happening inside the bodies of 400 people. But there's one dimension of this that no physiological measurement can capture. Imagine being unable to stop. Imagine knowing with complete clarity that your body is failing, that your feet are destroyed, that you're exhausted beyond anything you've ever felt, that you want more than anything to just sit down, and you can't. Your body will not obey you. You are trapped inside yourself, moving against your will, in public, in pain, while the people around you watch and don't know how to help. That specific experience of losing control of your own body is a particular kind of horror that goes far beyond the physical. And the people watching, the families, the neighbors, the priests, couldn't stop it either. That's the human reality underneath the historical mystery.
500 years, hundreds of academic papers, multiple full-length books dedicated entirely to this event. And the question at the center of it all still doesn't have a clean answer. What actually caused the dancing plague of 1518? There are 3 serious theories. Each explains some of what happened. None explains all of it. Theory 1. Ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye grain under cold, wet conditions. The years leading up to 1518 in the Rhine Valley had been exactly that, cold and wet. Rye bread was the dietary staple of the poor in Strasbourg. If the grain supply were contaminated with ergot, nearly everyone in the city would have been eating it regularly. The symptoms of ergotism include violent muscle spasms that can cause involuntary movement, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, psychosis, confusion, and, in severe cases, death. A population eating contaminated rye, already weakened by hunger, experiencing convulsions and hallucinations, could that look, from the outside, like dancing? Possibly. But the theory has real problems. Ergotism typically produces seizures and convulsions, not the sustained, coordinated, rhythmic movement that historical accounts describe. And ergotism would be expected to affect everyone eating the contaminated bread, not to spread selectively from person to person in the pattern this epidemic followed. Theory 2. Mass psychogenic illness. This is the explanation most strongly favored by the majority of current historians and medical researchers, and it needs careful explanation because it's widely misunderstood. Mass psychogenic illness is not people faking it. It's not a group pretending. It's a genuinely recognized medical phenomenon in which extreme psychological stress produces real physical symptoms. Real involuntary movement, real pain, real loss of bodily control. The origin is in the nervous system's response to overwhelming stress, but the symptoms are entirely real. Historian John Waller, who wrote the most comprehensive modern academic study of this event, argues this explanation most forcefully. His core argument: the people of Strasbourg in 1518 were under a level of psychological pressure that is difficult for us to fully appreciate. Famine, epidemic, spiritual crisis, and the absolute cultural certainty that Saint Vitus could strike people with uncontrollable movement. That last part is critical. They didn't just vaguely believe something bad could happen to them. They had a specific, named, culturally embedded expectation of exactly this kind of affliction. When one person, perhaps already at the absolute edge of psychological endurance, began experiencing genuine involuntary movement, the people around her didn't think, "What strange illness is this?" They thought, "Saint Vitus's dance. This is real. This is happening, and I might be next." And in the neurological conditions created by extreme stress in a community that completely shared that belief, that expectation itself became a mechanism of transmission, not through physical contagion, through the human nervous system's extraordinary susceptibility to the beliefs and behaviors of the people around it. Theory 3. Religious trance. A smaller body of scholarship suggests that some of what happened may have roots in specific ecstatic religious practices from the folk culture of the region. Certain traditions involved deliberately inducing trance states through rhythmic movement, states in which the practitioner temporarily lost normal voluntary control. This theory is less a complete explanation and more a possible origin point for how Frau Troffea began, that she entered a trance state she perhaps entered before in a religious context, and that the public, uncontrolled expression of it triggered a cascade in others who shared the same cultural framework. So, what actually happened? Honestly, we don't know for certain. No single theory accounts for every documented detail. What the evidence does confirm is that this was real. The dancing happened. The deaths happened. The city records, the medical accounts, and the church archives are not fabricating a mass fiction. Something extraordinary happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, and whatever it was, The people caught inside it were genuinely suffering.
By August of 1518, the Strasbourg City Council had reached an unavoidable conclusion. Everything they had tried had failed. The open spaces, the musicians, the policy of letting the dancing exhaust itself. None of it had worked. The crisis had gotten worse. People were dying, and the strategy based on medical theory and religious interpretation had produced results that couldn't be defended. They reversed course completely. The musicians were dismissed. The guild halls were closed, the designated dancing spaces were shut down, and the council made a new decision. They would take the afflicted individuals, those who could be moved, to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the mountains near Saverne, 30 kilometers outside the city. A formal religious ceremony would be conducted. Masses would be said, prayers would be offered. Everything within the power of the clergy would be done. What followed must have been one of the strangest processions in European history. People moving through the countryside outside Strasbourg, some still moving involuntarily, some being carried, some barely conscious, making their way through the summer heat toward a mountain shrine, seeking mercy from a 4th century martyr. Some accounts mention a detail that historians find striking. The dancers were given red shoes at the shrine. In the folk tradition of the region, red shoes carried specific symbolic weight in connection with Saint Vitus. Whether this detail is accurate across all accounts is uncertain, but it appears consistently enough to take seriously. At the shrine, the religious ceremonies were performed, and gradually, the dancing stopped. Not all at once, not immediately, but the accounts from this period describe a slow subsiding, numbers decreasing, the compulsion weakening. People who had been trapped in movement for days or weeks finding themselves able, finally, to be still. By September of 1518, approximately 2 months after Frau Troffea first stepped into the street, the dancing plague of Strasbourg was effectively over. Why did the shrine work when the musicians hadn't? If you believe in mass psychogenic illness as the mechanism, then removing people from Strasbourg itself may have been the critical intervention. The environment that had generated and sustained the outbreak was removed. The densely packed city, the shared fear, the continuous witnessing of others dancing. Taking people out of that environment, combined with focused ritual, physical distance, and time, may have broken the psychological cycle. If you believe in Saint Vitus, the answer is simpler. The prayers were heard. The historical record can't tell us which of these is true. What it can tell us is that the dancing stopped, and that Strasbourg would never be quite the same city it had been before. Here's something the textbooks don't always mention. The dancing plague of 1518 was not a one-time event in human history. Similar episodes of mass, uncontrollable movement had been documented in Europe going back to at least the 13th century. In 1374, nearly 150 years before Strasbourg, mass outbreaks of dancing mania occurred in multiple cities along the Rhine simultaneously. Aachen, Cologne, Metz, hundreds of people affected, the same descriptions, the same apparent involuntary quality, the same terror from the surrounding population. Further incidents appear in the records across the 1400s. The 1518 event was the largest and the most thoroughly documented, but it was part of a pattern, a recurring phenomenon that appeared wherever the right combination of conditions came together. Extreme collective stress, deep shared belief in the reality of supernatural affliction, a population pushed to the physical and psychological edge. Which leads to a question that's harder to dismiss than it might first appear. Has it actually stopped?
In 2011, a group of teenage girls in Leroy, New York, a small town most people have never heard of, began developing involuntary tics, repetitive movements, uncontrollable verbal outbursts. The symptoms spread through the school community. News cameras arrived. Medical teams were called in. After extensive investigation, authorities classified it as mass psychogenic illness. In 2012, dozens of students in a school in Colombia were hospitalized after experiencing seizures and fainting spells. No physical cause was found. Same classification. The medical literature documents dozens of similar events across the 20th and 21st centuries, in schools, in workplaces, in communities under specific forms of collective stress. The conditions change, the symptoms adapt to the cultural moment. The explanations shift from St. Vitus to psychiatry. But the underlying mechanism, the human nervous system producing physical symptoms that spread through communities under extreme stress, appears to be a permanent feature of what we are. The dancing plague of 1518 isn't just history, it's a pattern, and the pattern hasn't ended.
There's a version of this story where the takeaway is simple. Medieval people were superstitious, they didn't have science, they made bad decisions, and then they got lucky when the shrine worked. That version is comfortable. It puts 500 years of distance between us and us, but it's not the honest version. Because the city council of Strasbourg in 1518 was not stupid people. They were educated, experienced, and genuinely motivated to help. They consulted the best medical expertise available to them. They applied religious frameworks that had genuine authority and genuine historical precedent. They acted in complete good faith on everything they believed to be true, and they made things dramatically worse. Because what they believed to be true wasn't adequate to the reality in front of them. Every generation operates within the limits of its own understanding. Every era has frameworks that feel, from the inside, complete and sufficient, right up until the moment a crisis arrives that those frameworks can't contain. The people of 1518 had the four humors and the theology of St. Vitus. We have our own frameworks, our own confident assumptions, our own blind spots that we can't see because we're inside them. The dancing plague asks an uncomfortable question. What crisis exists right now that your frameworks are failing to explain? What are you doing in perfect good faith with the best available information that is making things worse? That's not a comfortable question, but it's the question that 500 years of this story are pointing at.
It is the summer of 1518. A Frau Troffea steps out of her house in Strasbourg, Europe, and begins to dance. She doesn't know her name will survive 5 centuries. She doesn't know historians will write books about her. She doesn't know that people across the world, in a future unrecognizable to everything she's ever known, will still be arguing about what happened to her. She only knows that she cannot stop. And in that single, terrible experience of being unable to stop, of being trapped inside something she cannot control, in the middle of a world that has no answer for her, she is not as far from us as the 500 years between us might suggest. We all know what it is to carry more than we can hold, to look for explanations in the wrong places because the right ones don't exist yet, to watch something unfold and feel, despite everything, helpless. The dancing plague of 1518 is not a curiosity. It is a document of what it means to be human, in a body we don't fully understand, in a society we can't fully control, in a world that doesn't always yield to our attempts to explain it. The mystery may never be solved. Frau Troffea may never be more than a name in an archive, but the question she left behind,
What happens when human beings lose control of themselves and the world around them has no answer is not a question that belongs to 1518. It belongs to every moment a person has ever looked at the world and found it beyond their understanding, which means it belongs to right now as much as it ever did.
If this story stayed with you, if it made you question something, feel something, think differently about something, that is exactly what history is supposed to do. History is not memorizing dates. It is a record of real human beings trying to survive things they didn't understand. And the more honestly we study them, the more clearly we can see ourselves. If this documentary was worth your time, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want history told the way it actually was. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think caused the dancing plague. Ergot? Mass psychogenic illness? Something our framework still can't name? I read every comment, and this is a conversation worth having. Subscribe to the History Experiment, because there are hundreds more stories like this one. Strange, dark, deeply human, and completely real. Share this with someone who thinks they know history. I promise you, they haven't heard this one. See you in the next episode.